Welcome to episode number 4 of History for Shut-ins, Revolutionary Mothers and Fathers. Today, we are going to discuss Molly Pitcher, Mumbet, Freeman, Robert Morris, and others. I want to start by talking about the flag behind me. This is the 1st Troop Philadelphia Cavalry flag, as I get out of the way. It was founded in 1774, the City Cavalry, and it is the oldest continuously serving unit of the Pennsylvania National Guard. This flag was flown at battles at Trenton, as well as others. So, let's get underway with talking about Molly Pitcher. Molly Pitcher actually is not a single historical figure, but a composite folk hero who was inspired by the actions of different people, most of them women, who carried waters to troops during the Revolution. 2 women in particular have been associated with the legend of Molly Pitcher. The first is Mary Ludwig Hayes Macaulay, who was born in 1754 and is the daughter of a New Jersey dairy farmer. At the age of 13, she went to work as a servant and married a barber named William Hayes. When the war began, William enlisted and became a gunner in the Pennsylvania Artillery. Mary eventually joined her husband as a camp follower during the Philadelphia campaign of 1777 and 1778 in New Jersey, eventually wintering with the army at Valley Forge. Legend that Mary was carrying water for the troops at the Battle of Monmouth in June of 1778, but when her husband was wounded, she abandoned her water jugs and took up loading the artillery in his place. Joseph Plum Martin, a soldier in the Continental Army, was present at the battle. His memoirs, which were not discovered until the 1950s, have become an important primary source about the experiences of ordinary soldiers during the Revolution. Washington observed her heroics on the battlefield and issued her a commendation, and Mary was allegedly called by the nickname Sergeant Molly for the rest of her life. However, there is some debate on where history ends and folklore begins. There is no record of the commendation from Washington. Martin's single account is the only evidence available about Hayes' contributions. At the close of the war, William and Mary Hayes returned to Pennsylvania. They settled in Carlisle, where Mary went back to work as a domestic in the State House in Carlisle. William died in 1786. Mary then married John Macaulay, who had also served in the war. She was awarded a pension in 1822 by the Pennsylvania State Legislature, and it wasn't until the 100th anniversary of the war in 1876 that a marker noting her service was placed on her grave. The other individual who is attributed the Molly Pitcher nickname is Margaret Corbin. She was the first woman to receive a military pension after the war. She was born in Franklin County, Pennsylvania in 1751, was orphaned at 5 when her father was killed during an Indian raid, and her mother was taken captive, never to return. She and her brother were adopted and raised by an uncle. In 1772, she marries John Corbin, who joined the Pennsylvania military 3 years later. Instead of staying at home, Margaret left with her husband for the war, becoming a camp follower, earning money, cooking, doing laundry for soldiers, and things of that sort. She also helped take care of the sick and the wounded. On November 16, 1776, Corbin dressed as a man and joined her husband in the Battle of Fort Washington on Manhattan Island. There she helped load cannon. When he was killed, her husband, She quickly and heroically took over firing of the cannon. Other soldiers commented on Captain Molly's steady aim and sure shot. Eventually, she is hit by enemy fire, which nearly severs her left arm and severely wounds her jaw and left breast. She was unable to use her left arm the rest of her life. The British eventually win this battle, with Corbin among the prisoners of war who were paroled and released back to the care of Revolutionary War hospitals. Left to support herself alone, she struggles financially. After she recovers, Corbin joined the Invalid Regiment at West Point, where she aided the wounded until she was formally discharged in 1783. Then, on July 6, 1779, the Continental Congress, in recognition of her service, awarded her a lifelong pension equivalent to half that of male combatants. Congress also gave her a suit of clothes to replace the ones that were ruined during the conflict. Corbin died near West Point on her 50th birthday. In 1926, at the 150th anniversary of independence, her remains were moved to West Point, where she was buried with full military honors. A plaque at Fort Tryon in the War for Liberty. Before I move on, I want to let people know, if you have any questions throughout the session, the live session, please type it in. We'll stop and we'll talk. And for those watching the tape session, feel free to leave a question here, which I will gladly answer before tomorrow's session of History for Shut-ins. The next person that we are going to discuss is Elizabeth Freeman. She was known as Bet, B-E-T, or Mumbet. She was among the first slaves in Massachusetts to sue for and win her freedom. She was born in 1742 into slavery. She was given to the Ashley family of Sheffield, Massachusetts in her early teens. During her enslavement to the Ashley family, she marries and has a child named Betsy. In 1780, Mrs. Ashley swings at Betsy with a heated shovel. Bet shields her daughter and gets a deep wound in her arm. She left this wound uncovered as it healed as evidence that she had been treated harshly. Soon after the war, Bet heard the Massachusetts Constitution read aloud in Ashley's home. Remember, it was written by John Adams, and heard these words from Article 1. Quote, all men are born free and equal and have certain natural, essential, and unalienable rights, among which may be reckoned the right of enjoying and defending their lives and liberties, that of acquiring, possessing, and protecting property, in fine, that of seeking and obtaining their safety and happiness, unquote. Bet recognizes the potential legal and moral importance of these words and sought an attorney to sue for her freedom under the newly ratified state constitution. With the help of Theodore Sedgwick, who is an attorney from Stockbridge and is also a noted abolitionist, she pleads her case in the Court of Common Pleas in Great Barrington in August of 1880. When the jury rules in her favor, she becomes the first African American woman to be set free under the Massachusetts Constitution. Her case serves as precedent in the state Supreme Court case, that brought an end to slavery in Massachusetts. As a free woman, she takes the name Elizabeth Freeman. She works as a governess in the Sedgwick household until the Sedgwick children were grown, and then she and her daughter Betsy bought and moved into their own house in Stockbridge, where she was widely recognized and in demand for her skills as a midwife, a nurse, and a healer. She dies in 1829. Next on the hit parade is Robert Morris. Robert is born near Liverpool in 1734. At the age of 13, he immigrates to Maryland to join his father, who is a tobacco exporter. After very brief schooling here in Philadelphia, he obtains employment with Thomas and Charles Willings, well-known shipping and banking firm. In 1754, he becomes a partner of the firm, and for almost 4 decades is one of the company's directors, as well as a very influential Philadelphia citizen. He marries Mary White at 35. They have 5 sons and 2 daughters. During the Stamp Act turmoil in 1765, a quick note, yesterday was the anniversary of the Stamp Act being passed. Morris in 1765 joins other merchants in protest, but it wasn't until the outbreak of hostilities a decade later, basically Lexington and Concord, that he fully commits himself to the revolution. In 1775, the Continental Congress contracts with his firm to import arms and ammunition. He is elected to the Pennsylvania Council of Safety, 1775 to 1776, the Committee of Correspondence, the Provincial Assembly during the same period, 1775-1776, the Pennsylvania Legislature, 1776 to 1778, and the Continental Congress, 1775 to 1778. He is involved, as you can see. On July 1st, 1776, he actually votes against independence, which he considered premature. On the 2nd of July, he purposely absents himself to facilitate an affirmative ballot for independence by the Pennsylvania State Legislature, or delegation, I should say, to the Continental Congress. He is a key congressman. He specializes in financial affairs and military procurement. Although he and his firm profited quite handsomely, if it wasn't for him, the Continental Army probably would have been forced to break up because they would not have had the needed tools. He worked closely with Washington. He coaxes money from the various states. Remember, at this time, our army is really an army in name only. Much of the army is made up of state militias, and the New York governor has more control over his militia and the outfitting of it than Washington or Congress. Morris borrows money in the face of overwhelming difficulty and obtains personal loans to help further the war. Immediately following his congressional service, he sits for 2 more terms in the Pennsylvania State Legislature from 1776 to 1781. During this time, Thomas Paine, remember in our discussion with Paine, Paine went after Silas Deane and others in Congress, and really in the Pennsylvania State Legislature, attacking them for profiteering, which Paine investigates the accounts through secret sorts of information that Congress says Paine should not have used. Although Congress vindicates Morris, his reputation suffers greatly. He embarks on the most dramatic phase of his career by accepting the office of Superintendent of Finance, 1781 to 1784, under the Articles of Confederation. Remember, we're still a good 5 years from the Constitution. Congress recognizes how poorly our national finances are because of the war debt, and also its impotence in addressing those war debts. So what they do is they grant Morris basically dictatorial powers, and they acquiesce to his demand that he be allowed to continue his private commercial enterprises. Of course, that would be huge. Slashes all governmental and military expenditures. He personally purchases Army and Navy supplies. He tightens accounting procedures. He prods the states to fulfill their quotas of money and supplies, and when necessary, he actually overextends his own personal credit by issuing notes over his own signature or borrowing from friends. So you can see he's got a lot of Alexander Hamilton in him from the financial point of view. To finance the Yorktown campaign in 1781, Morris obtains a sizable loan from France. He uses part of it, along with some of his own fortune, to organize the Bank of North America, chartered that December. This is before the First National Bank is chartered at the end of the decade. The first government-incorporated bank in the United States. It helps to aid war financing. It shows the French and the Spanish and the Dutch and everybody else internationally that colonials are getting loans from that we are serious about repaying our debts. Although Morris is reelected to the Pennsylvania State Legislature in 1785-86, his private ventures consume most of his time. He attends the Annapolis Convention, which is truly the first convention prior to the Constitutional Convention to try and address the shortcomings of the Articles of Confederation. States, governors from various states do not send enough representatives down to the Annapolis Convention because they don't want the Articles of Confederation changed. Because, again, under the Articles, governors have more power in a state than Congress does nationally. He also attends the Constitutional Convention, where he sympathizes with Federalists. Who are the Federalists? Some of them: Hamilton, Washington, John Adams, and the like. Remember, they want a strong central federal government. Although in attendance at every meeting, he only speaks twice in debates and does not serve on any of the committees. In 1789, he declines Washington's offer to be the first Secretary of the Treasury. Who ends up being the first Secretary of the Treasury? Alexander Hamilton. So it shows you the light that Robert Morris was seen in. And this is a guy who's greatly forgotten by history. He takes a U.S. Senate seat. He serves from 1789 to 1795. During the later years of his public life, he speculates wildly, often on overextended credit in lands in the West and also the site of the new capital, Washington, D.C. In 1794, he begins to build a mansion on Chestnut Street in Philadelphia, which was designed by Major Pierre Charles L'Enfant, who helps to design Washington, D.C. Morris attempts to escape his creditors by retreating to the Hills, which is a country estate along the Schuylkill River on the edge of Philadelphia that Morris had acquired in 1770. He is arrested in 1798 and forced to abandon completion of the mansion, known in its unfinished state as Morris's Folly. Morris is thrown into debtor's prison. By the time he's released in 1801 under a federal bankruptcy law, his property and his fortune has been vanished. His health is declining. He lingers on in poverty, living in a simple Philadelphia home on an annuity attained by his wife, by fellow signer Gouverneur Morris. There is no relation there. We'll talk about Gouverneur Morris later. Robert Morris dies in 1806, and he is buried at Christ Church in Philadelphia. We are next going to talk about Emily Geiger. The Carolinas were invaded by the British in 1781 as part of their southern strategy. Nathaniel Greene, who we will talk about, Thomas Sumter, Henry Light Horse Harry Lee, and Francis Marion were waging an all-out campaign in South Carolina to get rid of the British. Greene actually spends 28 days trying to capture the fort at 96 South Carolina, heck of a town name, but had been forced to retreat when he discovers that the British General Lord Francis Rawdon was coming with reinforcements. Greene felt that Rawdon's men were vulnerable, but he knew that Greene lacked the manpower to win the skirmish. If Greene could get a message to Sumter, the two units could join forces and attack Rawdon. Two things made getting a message to Sumter extremely difficult. First, there were 70 miles of difficult terrain between the two forces. And the area, secondly, was a hotbed of Loyalist sympathizers, or British sympathizers known as Loyalists. Greene hesitates to order any of his men, who were exhausted and weak, not only from the heat, but lack of food, to undertake such a ride. He calls for a civilian to carry the message. No one could be found. About 2 miles from where Greene and his army had camped, there was the residence of a well-to-do farmer named John Geiger, a loyal and outspoken patriot. But John is invalid. His 18-year-old daughter, Emily, is an ardent patriot, and she volunteers. Without saying anything to her father, she leaves the farm and goes to Greene's camp and asks to speak to Nathaniel Greene. She says, "I will carry the message to Sumter." Greene was initially leery, but Emily says, "I know this area like the back of my hand. I can take back roads and whatnot and avoid the British at all costs." Desperate, Greene says, "I will send you." He writes his message, and Emily's on her way. Unknown to Emily, there is a Tory spy who had seen her leave Greene's camp. He reports her activities to another Tory named Lowry, who in turn sends a man to get Emily. Unsuspecting, Emily continues her journey until she is forced to stop and stay the night with strangers who are also Tories. In the middle of the night, the man who had been tracking Emily arrives at the house where she is sleeping. He decides to rest a few hours before taking custody of her. Emily figures out what's happening, and while the others are asleep, she sneaks out a window, saddles her horse, and rides away. Emily makes it 2/3 of the way to the Sumter camp when she sees 3 British soldiers coming toward her. Of course, the sight of a young woman traveling alone from the direction of Greene's camp makes the soldiers very suspicious. When they question her, they become even more suspicious. They take her captive and they take her to Lord Rawdon. He questions her. He considers her answers extremely evasive and orders her to be locked up in one of the upper rooms of the guardhouse until another woman can be found to search her. Emily is thinking of what she can do next. Being found with a message would mean that she would be tried and most likely hung as a spy, even though she's a woman. What does she do? She memorizes the message, and then she basically eats the message in small pieces, bit by bit by bit. Finally, a woman appears to search her, but nothing can be found. Lord Rawdon releases Emily. He gives her an escort to a house a few miles away where she eats and she rests. She rides on until 3 p.m. of the 3rd day, reaching General Sumter. Hungry, tired, almost fainting from not eating and being so tired, she delivers the message. Within an hour, Sumter is ready to march to meet Greene, where they will then fight Rawdon. Next, we will discuss Nancy Hart. Nancy is a Georgia frontierswoman who made it her mission to rid the Georgia territory of Tories, of loyalists, of the British. According to various accounts, she killed 1, captured 6, and oversaw the hanging of 5 others. She serves as a spy. She is born Anne Morgan, and there are questions of whether she's born in Pennsylvania or North Carolina. Little is actually known of her birth date. Her nickname was Nancy, a nickname for Anne. She was an imposing redhead who grew to be 6 feet tall and very muscular, working on the frontier. Local Cherokees referred to her as quote-unquote war woman or Wahachi. There is some talk that she's actually a relative of Daniel Boone. She was illiterate but knew much about frontier survival. She's a skilled herbalist, hunter, an excellent shot, despite being cross-eyed. This almost sounds too good to be true. I'm sure there's some legend here. She marries Benjamin Hart at the age when she is 36, and in 1771, the couple settled along the Broad River in Wilkes County, Georgia. She has 6 sons and 2 daughters. During the Revolution, while her husband is away, like Abigail Adams, like other women that we have discussed, Hart manages their farm, though she often snuck off to spy on the British. Dressed as a man, she would enter British camps pretending to be feeble-minded to gain information. Hart fought in the war and may have been present at the Battle of Kettle Creek on Valentine's Day, 1779. The British frequently stopped at the Hart house, keeping an eye on her. In one instance, Hart's daughter noticed a Tory spying through a hole in the wall. Hart was making soap and threw a boiling ladle full through the crack, scalding the spy. She and her daughter then turned him over to the Continental Army. Hart's most famous act involved 6 British soldiers who killed her last turkey and demanded that she cook it for them. She devised a plan to get the soldiers drunk on corn liquor that she had made, and then take their guns and hold them captive. Hart sent her daughter to get some water and used a hidden conch shell to alert neighbors of the British presence. While the soldiers ate and drank, Hart began sneaking their guns through a hole in the wall. Caught holding the 3rd gun, she threatened to shoot them. When a soldier rushed at her, she killed him and wounded another. The rest of the British soldiers surrendered. When her husband returned, Hart is holding the British soldiers at bay at gunpoint. They, along with neighbors, hung the soldiers from a nearby tree. In 1912, 6 bodies were found remains were buried near the Hart home, believed to have been the 6 British soldiers. In the late 1790s, the Harts moved to Brunswick, Georgia, where Benjamin dies around 1800. Hart then returned to Broad River and found her cabin had been washed away. She then moved to Henderson County, Kentucky in 1803 near her son. She lives to the age of 93. In the 1930s, the Daughters of the American Revolution erected a replica of the Hart cabin using some of the original stones. In Georgia, there is a county, a city, a lake, and a highway, all named for for Nancy Hart. The next individual that we're going to discuss is Gouverneur Morris. And this may be where we end the day because there's a good little bit here. So Morris is born, and again, no relation to Robert Morris. He's born at Morrisania Estate in Westchester County, which is presently the Bronx. In 1752, his family is very wealthy, and his family has a long record of public service. His elder half-brother, Louis, actually signed the Declaration of Independence. He's educated by private tutors at a Huguenot school in New Rochelle, New York. In early life, he loses a leg in a carriage accident. He attends King's College, which later becomes Columbia College and then Columbia University in New York City. He graduates in 1768 at the age of 16. In 1771, after reading law in New York City, he gains admission to the bar. Morris becomes interested in political affairs. Think of it, 1771, things are happening, right? We've already had the Boston Massacre. You've had the Stamp Act and the Intolerable Acts. So revolutionary fervor is building. Because he was so conservative, he at first feared the revolutionary movement, which he believed would bring mob rule. Some of his family and many of his friends are loyalists. Think about it. They thrived under English rule here in the colonies. Beginning in 1775, he starts to see the light and he sides with Whigs. That same year, representing Westchester County, he takes a seat in New York State's Revolutionary Provincial Congress and serves from 1775 to 1776. In 1776, he serves in the militia along with John Jay and Robert Livingston. He drafts, along with them, I should say. He didn't serve with them. With them, Jay and Livingston, he drafts the first New York State Constitution. He joins the New York State Council of Safety in 1777. In 1777 and 1778, Morris sits in the New York State Legislature, and in 1778, 1779 in the Continental Congress, where he is among the youngest members. During this period, he signs the Articles of Confederation. He drafts instructions for Benjamin Franklin, who was a diplomat in Paris, as well as those that provided a partial basis for the Treaty of Paris of 1783 that ends the Revolutionary War. He is a very close friend of Washington. He is one of Washington's strongest congressional supporters. Remember from previous conversation, many in Congress thought that Washington was an ineffective leader because he was losing more battles than he'd won. Of course, as we've discussed, Washington knew that if he went head-to-head with the British, the revolution would be over in a heartbeat. So his idea was to string it out, make them run all over hell and creation, chasing the army, and Washington would take his opportunities to take a shot at the British. Defeated in his bid for re-election to Congress in 1779 because of his opposition to New York State Governor Clinton's faction, Robert Morris relocates to Philly and resumes the practice of law. In 1781, he resumes his public career when he becomes the principal assistant to Robert Morris, who's the superintendent of finance for the U.S. colonies, to whom, again, there is no family relation whatsoever. Gouverneur Morris works with Robert Morris over the next 4 years in that capacity. Gouverneur Morris emerges as one of the leading figures of the Constitutional Convention. His speeches, which were more frequent than anyone else, numbered 173. Although many of them, well, not many, some of them are presented in a very light vein. They were usually very substantive. A strong advocate of nationalism and aristocratic rule, he served on many committees. He helps to draft the Constitution. When we talk about aristocratic rule, by the way, that's federalism. He's a federalist. He wants a strong national leader. Morris leaves public life for a time to devote his attention to business. Having purchased the family home from his half-brother Louis, he moves back to New York. In 1789, he joins in a business venture with Robert Morris and travels to France, where what's happening in France in 1789? It's the beginnings of the French Revolution. Morris remains in Europe for about a decade. In 1790-1791, he undertakes a diplomatic mission to London to try to negotiate some of the outstanding issues and problems between the British and the U.S. Remember, after the Treaty of Paris, the British still have outposts in the Northwest territories, which at the time, it's not Washington State and Oregon, it's the northwestern part of the colonies of the nation at the time. The mission fails, and in 1792, Washington appoints him as minister to France. He replaces Thomas Jefferson. Morris is recalled 2 years later, but does not come home. Instead, he travels extensively in Europe for the next 4 years, during which time he handles very complicated business affairs and is looking at, again, you're now in the real high watermark of the French Revolution and Napoleon and whatnot. So he's seeing all these things happening. Morris returns to the United States in 1799. In 1800, he is elected to finish an unexpired term in the U.S. Senate. He's an ardent Federalist. He is defeated in his bid for re-election in 1802. Who else loses in 1802? What noted Federalist? John Adams. Thomas Jefferson, a Democratic Republican, is elected president. Morris retires. In 1809, he marries Anne Carey Randolph of Virginia, and they have one son. During his final years, he continues to speak out against the Democratic Republicans, and he actually opposes the War of 1812. In the years 1810 to 1813, he serves as chairman of the Erie Canal Commission. Morris dies in 1816 at the age of 4 in the Bronx. You know what? I lied to you guys. We'll speak about one more because we still have some time here. We are going to talk about Sybil Ludington. Sybil Ludington is born in New York in 1761. She is the oldest of 12 children. In addition to working as a farmer, her father was a grist mill owner who served in the military for more than 60 years, including during the French and Indian War. He was loyal to the crown until 1773. He is promoted to colonel of the local regiment. His land is along a route between Connecticut and the coast of Long Island Sound that was vulnerable to British attack. On April 26, 1777, Colonel Ludington receives word from a rider that the nearby town of Danbury, Connecticut, is under attack by British troops and needs help. At the time, Ludington's regiment had disbanded for planting season, and his men were miles apart at their various respective farms. With the rider too tired to continue and Colonel Ludington too focused on preparing for battle, Sybil rises to the cause. She rides through the night alerting the colonel's men at their farms of the danger and urging them to return to fight. She rides through dark woods and the rain, covering up to 40 miles. By the time she returns home, hundreds of soldiers are gathering at the Ludington farm to fight the British. Ludington's troops arrived too late, unfortunately, to defeat them. After the war, at the age of 23, she marries when she meets Edward Ogden. The couple had one son and they lived in Catskill, New York. Ludington's husband dies of yellow fever in 1799. 4 years later, she buys a tavern and helps her son become a lawyer. After her son dies in 1838, Ludington applies for a Revolutionary War pension since her husband had served in the military. Her pension is denied because the government says there is no sufficient proof of your marriage. At the age of 77, she dies in poverty. She was honored with a stamp by the U.S. Postal Service in 1975. There is a statue of her by Lake Glenida in Carmel, New York, and there are historical markers tracing the route of her ride through Putnam County. I am going to end there today. Before I do, are there any questions? If there are not, we will pick up again tomorrow at noon at this site, History for Shut-ins. The other thing I wanted to share is that I am putting together a YouTube channel under the same name, History for Shut-ins, because not everybody has Facebook. So you can catch taped presentations there. You can catch live and taped presentations here. Thank you all for joining. Have a great day, and we'll see you tomorrow at noon.